In this video, we continue our journey westward on our mission to visit all of the disused stations along the former Chicago Great Western Railroad route from Chicago to Olwine, Iowa. This time, we'll travel from our most previous point of departure, Lindenwood, westwards through Ogle County in northern Illinois, to Byron along the Rock River. In between, we'll visit the former station sites of Holcomb and historic Stillman Valley, plus artifacts of interest along the way.
From Lindenwood, we travel west-northwest along Elevator Road, which mirrors the old Chicago Great Western right-of-way, for almost 3/4 of a mile. We turn left, west-southwest, onto Lindenwood Road, and drive for a little over a mile until we reach Illinois Route 251. Heading north, we ride for a mile until we reach Holcomb Road and turn west. A little more than a mile along this country lane brings us to the middle of the quiet community of Holcomb, Illinois. We turn right onto 2nd Avenue and head north through town. A few blocks further brings us to Maple Street, where we turn right, heading east. Within a few hundred feet, just prior to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad tracks, and to our left, is the former site of the Holcomb Station.
The location of the CGW's former Holcomb Station was about 140 feet west of Junction Road and 50 feet north of Maple Street in Holcomb, Ogle County, Illinois. The station stood on the south side of the trackway, facing north, aligned roughly east-west, and in the southwest corner of the junction with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. The depot was initially a wooden structure, about 60 feet by 25 feet in dimension. However, it had a slightly modified design relative to most CGW stations of the period. The west end of the building had a gabled roof, looking very much like a typical CGW station. However, the east end of the structure had a hip roof, perhaps to accommodate the pronounced bay shifted to the northeast corner of the building, a bay which was more typically positioned in the middle of the building. This bay alteration may have been included so as to allow passengers and railroad employees a clear view of both the Chicago Great Western line as well as the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line passing north-south.
This station was one of the original Chicago Great Western depots along this stretch, built in the late 1880s. It served passengers and freight for over 60 years, before the passenger service was discontinued around 1950. At about the same time, the original Holcomb Depot was demolished or dismantled, and was replaced with the far humbler wooden freight station, perhaps 8 feet by 18 feet in dimension, aligned north-south. This modest station saw freight service until the 1960s, according to train timetables.
Holcomb was started as a railroad town, but not for the Chicago Great Western, but rather the Chicago, Rockford, and Northern Railroad, which created a depot here in 1875. Shortly thereafter, the town of Holcomb was platted by Joseph Sheaf, a local farmer and businessman, and veteran of the 2nd Illinois Cavalry in the Civil War. The community was named for William Horace Holcomb, who was then an officer of the Chicago, Rockford, and Northern Railroad, perhaps as an inducement. Holcomb himself resided with his family in Rochelle, Illinois, 10 miles to the south of Holcomb, where he also served as mayor for a time. His elegant Italianate brick home can still be seen at the intersection of 7th Street and 6th Avenue in Rochelle, Illinois. Holcomb passed away in 1908 and is buried in Bronzewood Cemetery in Oak Brook, DuPage County, Illinois.
By the time the Chicago Great Western came to town in 1887, creating a junction with the Chicago, Rockford, and Northern Railroad, the small town was already developing, with a general store, a grain elevator, a tavern, 2 blacksmith shops, and several dwellings. The arrival of the second railway boosted the community's growth even further.
Today, the Chicago Great Western Depot is long gone, with the freight station taken down by 1970. The site of the former station is now a small open field, shielded by a few rows of bushes and trees, while the former CGW right-of-way, approaching from the east, is a planted field of crops. The Chicago, Rockford, and Northern Railroad became part of the Chicago and Iowa Railroad in 1892, and has ultimately become part of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which of course is still very active. The hamlet of Holcomb yet lives on, fast approaching its 150th anniversary.
Along the route to the next former station at Stillman Valley, about 3 miles northwest of Holcomb, there once stood a large 100-foot-long wooden bridge, which passed over a ravine near Armour Road. This bridge was destroyed by fire in 1911, purportedly from a locomotive engine spark. Subsequent aerial photos indicate that the bridge was rebuilt, although satellite photos suggest that there is nothing remaining there today.
Departing Holcomb, we pass over the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy tracks, turning left onto Illinois Route 24 until we reach Big Mound Road. We turn left, heading west, and drive for almost 4 miles, passing the Beach Cemetery Prairie Nature Preserve to our right. When we reach Illinois Route 16, Meridian Road, we turn right, heading due north. We pass by Stillman Valley High School to our left. We turn west onto Pershing Road. Another third of a mile brings us to Walnut Street, where we turn north. Within a few hundred feet to our left, in what is now a parking area for a small commercial building, is the location of the former Chicago Great Western Station of Stillman Valley.
The Stillman Valley Depot originally stood about 140 feet west of Walnut Street, about 300 feet east of Pine Street, and about 110 feet south of Wilson Street in Stillman Valley, in Ogle County, Illinois. The station stood on the north side of the tracks. It was a wooden structure about 60 feet by 20 feet in dimension, according to 1939 aerial photos. And although we have not seen any close-up photos of the original depot, we believe it followed the classic CGW Victorian stick-style design, having been built in the late 1880s. A cyclone blew through Stillman Valley in 1898 and took the CGW station roof with it, but evidence suggests that the station was fully repaired. Sometime after 1939, likely in the late 1940s or early 1950s, the original Stillman Valley Depot was demolished and was replaced with a much smaller and more modest building, about 10 feet by 10 feet. This may have coincided with the elimination of passenger service in the 1950s.
Subsequent to when the Chicago Northwestern eliminated the former Chicago Great Western routes in the 1970s, much of the property along the former right-of-way was sold off in the 1980s. The Chicago Great Western tracks were removed at about this time, and it is likely that the modest depot was removed at this time as well. Today, the former station site is situated in the parking area of a commercial building, which spans the former station grounds.
Stillman Valley has a colorful early history, as it was the scene of one of the earliest battles in what was to be called the Blackhawk War, which occurred in the spring and summer of 1832. Like all of the land in present-day northern Illinois, this region was long inhabited by Native Americans, mostly the Sauk, Fox, and Potawatomi tribes. With the never-ending advance of U.S. settlers from the east, early treaties with various Native American tribal leaders had been signed in the early 1800s, ceding the Native American lands to the U.S. government, although these treaties were of questionable merit, even at that time.
Chief Blackhawk, a Sauk leader in Iowa Territory and now in his mid-60s, put little value in these treaties and believed that his people's rightful homelands were to the east of the Mississippi River, in what is today northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. With a band of perhaps 1,000 followers, consisting of men, women, and children, the aged Blackhawk crossed back from Iowa Territory into Illinois in the spring of 1832.
To counter this, a detachment of more than 270 militia, led by Major Isaiah Stillman, were sent to the Rock River Valley in pursuit of Blackhawk in mid-May of 1832. Stillman, a native of Massachusetts, was a 40-year-old merchant from Fulton County, Illinois. Stillman's detachment encamped near the present-day village of Stillman Valley, near what was then called Sangamo Creek, also known as Old Man's Creek.
As it happened, Chief Blackhawk was also encamped nearby Sycamore Creek, just a few miles to the north. When he learned of the presence of the nearby militia, he sent a small detachment to parley for a truce. But his emissaries were attacked by unruly soldiers under Stillman's command. Stillman's men followed the retreating detachment of Sauk, skirmishing with them along the way, until they stumbled into a hidden line of Blackhawk's warriors. Stunned and confused, Stillman and his militia were soundly defeated, their headlong charge quickly turning into a ragged retreat southwards, until they reached Dixon, Illinois, 25 miles southwest.
It was one of the more humiliating events of frontier militia history, an episode which gave permanent name to the place as Stillman's Run, a clever play on words, as run can mean both a small stream or rivulet, or a literal run. Blackhawk's band was eventually to be driven out of Illinois via Wisconsin 3 months later by a reorganized U.S. and volunteer military. But that is a whole story unto itself, and we'll leave that for another time.
Following Blackhawk's removal from northern Illinois, the land reopened for settlement by people from the eastern states. The first wave of settlers arrived in the 1830s, mostly of English extraction, and from the northeastern part of the U.S. The first U.S. post office established in the community in the mid-1840s was called Stillman, but then seems to have shifted northward to nearby Hale by the early 1850s. At about this time, immigrants from Germany and Sweden began to arrive and settle in large numbers within the Stillman Valley, filling in the open spaces and growing the population. By the 1860s, the unincorporated community was already being referred to as Stillman Valley.
In 1874, undoubtedly animated by the anticipated arrival of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, local businessman Joshua White platted the village of Stillman Valley on property that he rather conveniently owned. Within a year, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad established a train station profitably situated in Joshua White's new community, just along the north edge of town.
A little more than a decade later, the Chicago Great Western Railway established itself in the area, and similarly built a railway station in Stillman Valley, this time in the south portion of the village. The Chicago Great Western Depot featured considerable sidings to the south of the trackway, along with grain elevators and large stockyards, from which hogs and sheep were freighted.
Bolstered by the trade brought by the two railways, in 1900 the small town was prospering, with a population of about 500, and with 5 general stores, grain elevators, a bank, a cidery, a hotel, multiple taverns and blacksmith shops, a lumber yard, a slaughterhouse, and 3 creameries. In 1902, after finding the unmarked graves of several of Stillman's men, local citizens raised a monument to their memory and to the infamous battle that gave name to their community. But it was not until 1911 that the precinct finally incorporated as the village of Stillman Valley, ironically named for a man who is said to have surrendered the precinct as fast as a horse can gallop. Today, the hamlet of Stillman Valley endures and even thrives, having grown to a community of about 1,000 people.
Along the way to the next former station in Byron, we intend to visit 2 former CGW bridge sites, the second one still being in use. The first, however, is but a remnant and is located just a few miles west of here. Departing the Stillman Valley station, we drive a few blocks north to Roosevelt Street, Illinois Route 72, and turn left, heading west, taking us through the middle of the village of Stillman Valley. The establishment of Route 72 in the mid-1920s was perhaps more important in the long run to the viability of Stillman Valley, as it brought business and trade and helped to make up for the eventual loss of the railways. We drive along Illinois Route 72 for almost 2 miles, passing over Black Walnut Creek, which is where we hope to find remains of a CTW bridge. We'll park along the road, although there is little in the way of a road shoulder here.
There are no good footpaths to Black Walnut Creek, at least not with the heavy foliage of midsummer. The only way we'll get a good view of the former railroad bridge is unfortunately by standing along the heavily trafficked Illinois Route 72 bridge. We have to say that this is not very safe and would not recommend this to anyone, as there are only a few feet dividing the driving lane from the bridge parapet, with automobiles and trucks whizzing by at 50 to 60 miles per hour. But in plain view, just about 100 feet from the road, we can see several wood pylons in the middle of the creek, for what was likely a wooden pier for the former bridge. The midsummer foliage is regrettably too thick to get any view of whether anything survives of the east or west abutments. This bridge appears to have had a span on the order of 70 feet from east to west.
The next bridge heading into Byron is not only still very much intact, but also sees some limited use to this day, but for a different railway. It is the Chicago Great Western's Rock River Bridge. To get there, we'll make a small detour from our route to the Byron station. We continue in a generally westward direction along Illinois Route 72 for a little more than 2 miles, along the way traversing beneath an underpass of the Chicago Great Western, just a short distance from the Rock River. After bending southwards, Illinois Route 72 turns north, passing over the Rock River and into the heart of Byron. Rather than continuing on Route 72 towards the former station, we'll turn right onto Blackhawk Drive heading east. Along the way, we'll pass beneath another CGW underpass, this time on the northwest side of the Rock River. Several hundred feet further brings us to the entrance of an Illinois Department of Transportation public boat launch, just to our right. This publicly accessible location offers an excellent view of the former Chicago Great Western Bridge over the Rock River.
The bridge that we see today spans almost 800 feet across the Rock River, supported by 10 concrete piers and 2 abutments. Bridge engineers refer to this bridge as having a deck plate girder design. This bridge was built by the Chicago Great Western Railway in the 1957-58 timeframe to replace an older bridge.
The original bridge which spanned these waters was built in the earliest days of the Chicago Great Western and had a similar footprint, except that it only had 5 piers midstream with longer spans. This original bridge was designed as a steel truss bridge with shorter support columns. In fact, the newer 1957 bridge simply added 5 piers and reused the existing supports by increasing their height to match the new piers. The refashioned support columns were then refaced with concrete so as to match the new ones. Today, this bridge is owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway and sees only occasional use, primarily for freighting extra-large equipment to and from the nearby Byron nuclear plant.
Onwards to our final station on this leg of our journey. First, we'll travel the short distance via automobile to give our viewers a sense of how to get there. From the public boat launch parking area, we turn right, northeast, onto Blackhawk Drive and drive a short distance until we reach 3rd Street, where we turn left, heading west. We travel west for several blocks through Byron's residential areas. passing over the grade level crossings of the former CGW near Market Street until we reached Union Street. We turn north onto Union and drive about 500 feet before passing again over a grade level crossing of the former CGW railway. And just to our left, less than 200 feet west-northwest along the railway line, stood the former Byron station.
But let's now give you a different perspective and recreate a CGW train coming into the Byron station from the east by way of the trackway, now owned by Canadian Pacific, which was once the Chicago Great Western Trackway. We'll start at a short distance south of 2nd Street, not too far from the viaduct that passes over Blackhawk Drive. We head north-northwest over 2nd Street, passing by the Byron Water Tower to our left. We pass over the 3rd Street and then the Market Street crossings. Shortly thereafter, we pass over the Chestnut Street crossing, then the 4th Street crossing, followed by the Union Street crossing. A little more than 150 feet further, between Union Street and Walnut Street, brings us into the former Byron station, with the depot situated to our left, to the south of the tracks.
The Byron Depot was a wooden structure utilizing the classic CGW Victorian stick-style design, about 65 feet long by 23 feet wide. It was one of the original 1887 stations built by the Chicago Great Western, and like Sycamore and St. Charles to the east, was considered to be a full stop. A wood frame storage shed stood just to the east of the station and was about 25 feet by 15 feet in dimension. In its heyday, the station would have employed one station agent, 3 telegraphers, and 1 clerk.
Extensive sidings sat to the north of the trackway, extending several hundred feet to the west, towards the junction with the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad line, which had established a depot just a few blocks north in the decade earlier, in 1875. To the west of Walnut Street, coal sheds, feed sheds, and a water tower stood along the south of the rail yard, while large stockyards dominated to the north. A few hundred feet further west, near Colfax, stood grain elevators and large sheep sheds on the south side of the trackway.
Perhaps one of the more enduring and endearing images of Byron regarding the Chicago Great Western is that of being the home of the milk train service. For generations, every morning at 6:45 a.m., the Byron milk train left the depot heading east, consisting of a passenger car, mail and express car, and 2 empty milk cars. The daily rattling of milk cans was the wake-up call for anyone living within a few blocks of the depot. Departing Byron, the milk train would then stop at virtually every station eastward into Chicago to load the brimming milk cans that local farmers had faithfully carted in from their dairy farms. Some of the milk stops were so heavily laden with milk cans that they filled an entire train car. The additional cars were coupled to the expanding milk train on its journey east. By the time the burgeoning milk train arrived at Grand Central Station in Chicago at 11 a.m., it had typically grown to 7 to 8 milk cars in length.
After the milk cans were unloaded and emptied by Chicago dairy companies and reloaded onto the milk cars, the Byron milk train would make the reverse journey westward in the afternoon, unloading the empty labeled milk cans at each stop, returning them to their owners, who would be waiting to retrieve them. By 6:30 p.m., the depleted milk train would end its long day, pulling back into the Byron station and rail yard to prepare for the next day's journey.
The Byron station served the Chicago Great Western and the Byron community for almost 100 years. Only a windstorm in 1918, which unroofed the depot and blew over several train cars, temporarily kept the station from fulfilling its duties as a milk service, railway depot, and junction. Passenger service to the depot ended in the 1956 timeframe, but freight service continued for another 20 years. The depot was finally torn down around the 1985 timeframe, and a light industrial building was built in its place, spanning from Union Street to Walnut Street. Although much of the rail yard and sidings have been removed, most of the original Chicago Great Western Trackway, from the Rock River Bridge to the west side of town, still remains intact, with occasional use by the Canadian Pacific Railway.
Byron has a long legacy, going back to the earliest European settlement of northern Illinois. The area was first settled by the Sanford, Mix, and Reed families in the early 1830s, shortly after the departure of the Native Americans. The settlement was initially referred to as Fairview, but when a U.S. post office was established a few years later in 1838, it was initially dubbed Bloomingville by residents. This name, however, was rejected by U.S. Post Office administrators, as they felt it too close and thereby confusing with the previously established post office of Bloomington, Illinois. Early Ogle County settler and businessman Leonard Andrus, later partner with John Deere in plow manufacturing, suggested the name of Byron, as the well-read Andrus apparently greatly admired the then contemporary poet George Gordon, known widely as Lord Byron.
In time, the fledgling community incorporated as a village in 1878, shortly after the arrival of its first railway, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. The Chicago Great Western Railroad appeared next in 1887, making the north part of town a teeming and bustling interchange of goods and people. German and Swedish immigrants were among those that arrived by these trains, as the next wave of migration to the area in the late 1800s. Local industry thrived during this time, with the village supporting a plow factory, corn cannery, cheese factory, fertilizer factory, and lumber mill.
Today, Byron continues to thrive along the Rock River, with a growing population now pushing 4,000. Constellation Energy, the owner and operator of the Byron Nuclear Generating Station, just a few miles east of town, producing electrical energy since 1985, is among the chief employers of the region. Byron preserves its long legacy in a well-appointed history museum at the northwest corner of Blackhawk Drive and Union Street, just a short distance south of the Chicago Great Western Depot site.
We'll close out this chapter of our Chicago Great Western Disused Station tour here along the western banks of the Rock River, in Byron, in Ogle County, Illinois. If you're enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. It really helps us out and lets us know that these videos are important to our viewers. In the next episode of this journey, we'll continue onwards across northwest Ogle County into Stephenson County, Illinois, visiting the disused stations of Myrtle, Egan, German Valley, and beyond. We'll see you then.